You haven't. Thank you very much, Liz. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Just a couple minutes past. This is Una Daly, and I'm here with James Glappa-Grossklang, the co-directors of the Open for Anti-Racism program, and welcome to January 2023. We're really excited about the webinar today. And the topic itself was chosen based on feedback that we got from all of you in the original survey that you took when you joined the program and jumped into the Canvas course for the first time. And many of you let us know that open pedagogy was something new for you. And so even though we know that you had a great overview in the course, we wanted to make sure that that we could deepen that understanding. And we have some great folks today who have been doing this for a long time, who are going to share their experiences and with you. So, agenda. We have some calendar reminders we're going to go through. I think we're going to introduce the speakers first, and then we will get right into this webinar, which is implementing anti-racist teaching with, excuse me, with open pedagogy. So thrilled that you're all here, and I hope that you all had a nice holiday. Looking forward to seeing some information in the chat as well. And thank you, Amanda, for sharing the slides there with everybody. All right. I do want to introduce our speakers. I've had the pleasure of knowing both of these wonderful educators for some number of years. Amanda and I think, got acquainted first with California ZTZ degrees back in the mid 2000 teens. And Amanda's been not only is she a district and college-wide leader, as you can see there, the faculty coordinator for instructional design and outcomes, and the OER coordinator. She's a statewide leader and also a national leader. She and Jennifer Paris from College of the Canyons have been leaders in early childhood education OER development for many years now, and have really done some amazing work, which I think those of you who are in that discipline know about those wonderful texts that have been produced and are now being used around the country and perhaps even further. So welcome, Amanda. And she's at Reedley College, if I didn't mention that. And next, I'd like to introduce Suzanne Joachim, who I have known for over a decade. I remember Suzanne developing biology OER, Intro to Biology, for the Carnegie Mellon Project back, oh gosh, over a decade ago. And she's developed many other OERs since then. She is also a statewide and a national leader, in addition to being a biology faculty. And she's also the distance ed student learning outcomes and OER coordinator at her college, Butte Glen Community College. And both Amanda and Suzanne also sit on the OERI committees and provide leadership there, which I think all of you know through the Academic Senate. So amazing folks. And James, I know you as well know Amanda and Suzanne very well. If you want to throw in some accolades.
Oh gosh, I'm just so thrilled that Suzanne and Amanda have made time to be here. I learned so much from each of them every time I speak to them, and I've had the pleasure of participating in their joint presentations a number of times because we regularly book them to speak at College of the Canyons for our faculty retreats, and there's always tremendous positive feedback from our faculty. So I'm just tickled to learn more from my very dear friends, Suzanne and Amanda.
Yeah, and I have to say, Suzanne was doing open pedagogy well before we were using that term, with the work that she does in the classroom with her students around developing OER together, writing textbooks together. So we've got a couple of really wonderful experts here. And now I'm going to turn it over to James for the hard stuff, to talk about the calendar.
Sure. So real quick, a few reminders. We've got two or three slides of reminders here, everybody. For the spring, a number of activities coming up in the spring, besides or in addition to you implementing your action plan in your classes. We ask that throughout the spring semester, you provide us with feedback or reflections about how things are going in your classes. You'll see on the screen the dates. Those are due February 15th, April 1st, May 30th. Those are due in the Canvas shell that you used for your course. The prompts, the specific prompts will be provided in the Canvas shell that you used for your course. If you don't have notifications turned on in that Canvas shell, you might want to do that since you're not in there on a regular basis anymore. You might want to turn on notifications so that you hear when a new announcement goes out with the prompts or a reminder about the due dates for the reflections. Of course, we'll continue with the monthly webinars. We know that you are meeting monthly with your coaches. And then in April and May, some research activities will be popping up to help us document the impact of your work. First of all, there will be a student survey that we ask you to distribute to your students. Secondly, there will be a post survey for you, framing the experience with the first survey that you did upon starting the program. And there will be an opportunity for a small number of you, 7 of you, to participate in an in-depth hour-long interview with one of our researchers so that we get qualitative feedback in addition to quantitative feedback. And then there will also finally be a survey that will ask you to share with your participating administrator or supporting administrator. So all of that will come together to help us improve the program, but also to document the impact so that we can continue this program in the future by letting our funder know what a great job this program is doing. Also, if you have OER specific questions, please do reach out to the OER team at College of the Canyons. It's not an imposition that they are here to help you if you need help searching for content. You have questions about formatting or remixing or even licensing. So do reach out to them at the email you see on the screen there. Next slide, please. Also, here's a sneak peek of the webinars coming up for the spring. Just great topics. Kudos to Una for arranging, Una and Liz for arranging all of these topics. There's just a lot of great content coming up this spring. So we're looking forward to that. And then Liz, maybe you'll share in the chat the link to the webinar calendar that we see linked there on the slide, as well as the registration link. That link to the webinar calendar also will take you to the archives of past webinars from the fall, and then these webinars that we're doing this spring as well. And then next slide.
Thank you, James. I just did want to point out that we now have a QR code.
I see that, yes.
We've moved into the, I don't know which century it is, but yeah, Bitly now provides QR codes. So you can even check it out on your phone.
Great, so we've got options. Thank you. Okay, so today, after the great build-up with Suzanne and Amanda, I know it's going to be fabulous. Today's webinar is on practical steps for implementing anti-racist teaching with open pedagogy. Amanda and Suzanne are going to take us on a deep dive in open pedagogy and let us know how it can support what you're doing to make your teaching anti-racist. And they're going to share plenty of examples, and there will be time for discussion. So officially, we're going to run till 1:30. But I know Amanda and Suzanne have it in mind that we're going to have a healthy discussion as well. So make sure you stick around and make sure that you have the ability to participate in the chat or via audio. And with that, Suzanne and Amanda, dear friends, take it away.
Awesome. I am going to share my screen, so give me a second to get myself all situated here. Okay, so I just wanted to start by saying I am deeply honored and excited to be here sharing this with you. Una had me reminiscing just now. And so I wanted to share that Una was the first person to bring me into the world of open. Like I wouldn't have been here otherwise. I realized that there's just so many wonderful people, and this is definitely a space that I want to be a part of. And James has also been just an amazing mentor. He helped me realize that I can be a leader in a field, which I hadn't, it was kind of one of those growth opportunities. And so also would not be here without you, James. So with both Una and James are why I am here. So I'm so glad to be able to give back. So this presentation is practical steps for implementing anti-racist teaching with open pedagogy. We're going to start with a definition of open pedagogy, even though I know you've been talking about this and this was part of the Canvas course, but I think it helps to frame how we're approaching it, Amanda and I, so that when we move forward, we're all kind of from the same viewpoint. And yeah, Amanda, thank you for sharing the link to the PowerPoint in the chat. If folks want to download and follow along on your own screen, that's fine. The other reason that we're sharing this is there's going to be slides with a lot of quotes and research information for those that really want to delve into the research, but we're not going to read those for you. So you can read those later. Okay, oops. So let's talk about what is open pedagogy. And one of the first things I want to start with is there isn't a single definition, which as a biologist was incredibly frustrating for me for a long time. Like I like things in boxes. And so there was no clean box. There's no right or wrong way to do this. And recently I've been participating at Butte College with some culturally responsive training. And I realized that one of the reasons I was so uncomfortable with this not having a single answer is because of the white supremacist culture that we are all raised in this country, right? One of the components of that is this idea of right and wrong. There is a right answer and the one, and then there are other answers and those are wrong. And so open pedagogy has really helped me kind of expand past that. Like it's to this. So I want to share 4 different definitions, and each of them is valid, but also focused on something very different. So let's start with the first definition, and this one came out of a work by David Wiley, and so he was one of the early adopters of open pedagogy and really shared the definition with folks. This I'm calling OER enabled pedagogy because you have to have different titles for the slides for accessibility reasons. And so these all have slightly different titles. But this one really focuses on teaching and learning practices that are only possible because of the 5 R's, right? So this is really focused on OER is a core foundation for being able to do open pedagogy. And David Wiley was the first to introduce the idea of disposable versus renewable assignments, which I'm going to leave here as just a little teaser because Amanda's going to share more about that later in the presentation. So that's one, really focusing on the open part of it. This next definition is from the Open Pedagogy Notebook, which if you haven't had a chance to check out that link, it's great. They have definitions, they have a book where the whole global community is encouraged to annotate, and they have examples, which is always lovely. This definition is an access-oriented commitment to learner-driven education and a process of designing architecture and tools, and here's the key, that enable learners to share the public, to shape the public knowledge commons. Right? So this is all about our students shaping the public knowledge commons, which is a wonderful way to bring them into academia, right? This is moving students past the idea of just being passive recipients into a space where they are valued colleagues in the academic space. And this is so powerful for a lot of our disenfranchised or historically disenfranchised students who may not have been told that they belong. This is a great way to tell them that, yes, you do belong and you can add to the knowledge. This last definition is from a presentation from OE Global. So this is back in 2018, but a really wonderful presentation where open educational practices was defined really focusing on employing social and participatory technologies. So this definition is focused more on the collaborativeness of open, which for those that have been in the open space, that's a core tenet, right? Like that is why we work in the open, so that we can all work together and we can lift each other up and we can benefit from the skills that each other has. And so this is really focused on the social and community portion of open pedagogy. So like I said, these are very different, but they all bring an important piece to the puzzle. The last definition is one that really I made up, and so I'm going to share because I can. That's what happens when you give me a platform. This started with an image I found. This is from a French group about open government. And so how does this relate? If you think of our classroom as essentially a government, right? We, the instructor, can be an authoritarian dictator, or we can be more democratic in our approach to the classroom. So you can take a look at this image. I kind of pared it down to, there are three components to both an open government and an open classroom, right? Transparency. Students always know what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how they're involved. Participation. Students are part of the process. Again, not just passive recipients that we are dumping our immense knowledge on. They are participating in learning. And beyond just participating, collaboration. We are working with students to help them learn and to help the entire class learn the content better. And Amanda, thank you for sharing in the chat. There's a really great framework called the TILT framework that helps ensure that our assessments are transparent. So students always know how they're being assessed. So what does this have to do with an approach to anti-racism? So this quote I am going to read to you just because I think it might be small. And think about this through the framework of connecting open pedagogy and anti-racism, which is what you're doing. And so you've been thinking about this for a full semester, but I wanted to introduce this, this idea here. Okay, in higher education and in assessment, practitioners need to intentionally ask what majoritarian stories are informing our worldviews and how these potentially biased stories are distorting and silencing the experience of others. So I want to reflect on this just a little bit, because what this is getting at is we as practitioners, and in particular when we're designing assessments for this presentation, but also when we're designing teaching in our course design, but what we need to ask ourselves is what majoritarian stories are informing our worldview, and how is that affecting our teaching and our assessment? Because we all have biases, and being brought up in various cultures, we're coming with a worldview that is based on how we were raised, right? And so there are these majoritarian worldviews that are part of who we are. And this is about first accepting that, and then second, thinking how that affects how we assess students. So this next slide is why I mentioned you may want to download the PowerPoint to read later. The little teacup in the corner is an indication to me and Amanda that we're not going to read these. We're just going to move past them and let you mull these over later. Okay, and with that, Amanda, I'm going to turn it over to you.
And Suzanne very much did that for me, because she knows my temptation, as does probably James and Una, who've been with presentations for me, is to read those quotes, because I really do love them. So that was her beautiful, subtle reminder to me not to read them, especially since I had queued it up to read it despite that. So thank you, Suzanne, for holding me accountable. But I'm going to apologize. I happened to coincide this presentation with the furniture being constructed in the office. So if it's a little bit loud, I apologize. Thankfully, I talk super loud. So if you can't hear me, please let me know, and I can resort to shouting. That's very much not beneath me. All right, so like Suzanne said, we're going to talk a little bit about, actually a bit about assessment. And when Suzanne and I were talking through this presentation and how to really make it applicable, assessment kept coming up in our conversations, and we kept pushing back on this because, you know, we're reading through the description. It doesn't talk about assessment at all. So why were she and I being drawn back into a discussion of assessment. And so we really had to have conversations amongst ourselves. Is it because we're outcome coordinators and we really just love assessment that much, which we do, but how does that actually apply to anti-racist pedagogy and to open pedagogy? And we realized it collides full center to make it, you cannot look at applying anti-racist pedagogy and principles without looking at the assessments that you're going to implement. And please take a second to read through the research that we do quote on the slide, so you can see that although Suzanne and I have brilliant opinions, this is being fed from some amazing research that other people have done. So we're going to talk about how to get our assessments in gear to make sure that we are applying those anti-racist principles that we've been talking about and that you've been learning about, and how that can connect with open pedagogy. One of the things that we really want to make sure that we are clear about is all of these things overlay. So as we're talking about different implementations of assessment, such as project-based learning, disposable and renewable, the concept of open pedagogy, it can get overwhelming as these different vocabulary words are thrown around, how they relate. Are they mutually exclusive? Can I do one and not the other? And we're really going to advocate for this layering effect, that you can do open pedagogy without applying anti-racist principles. So those need to connect with one another. You can do anti-racist principles and anti-racist pedagogy and have horrible assessments. So these are all the concepts that need to work together with one another to really get to that point that we're all aspiring and working really hard to be. Okay, I think I'm ready for the next slide, Stan. So one of the things that we can do is talk about this concept of deconstructed assessment. And I don't want to add another vocabulary word to the long list that you have probably already encountered as you've done this work. So I want you to focus on the precepts or the tenets of what this means. And I know that's itty bitty writing, and that's why we did put the PowerPoint in the presentation. And I'm going to go through, not necessarily read, but talk about some of these tenets. I am going to read the quote at the top because I think it really does lay the framework and the groundwork of what a deconstructed assessment is. So assessment used as a vehicle to dismantle systems of power and oppression found in social structures. So again, that's that connection of how our assessment, what we do in our assessment of student learning, is a mechanism and a vehicle to help dismantle these systems that our students are facing, and that we perpetuate if we don't take the time to take a look at it. Deconstructed assessment is thus an approach that uses assessment to expose these social structures with a focus on what phenomena are being assessed, not just how. So again, that's the important. It's not just about how we do the assessment, and I'm going to talk about some ways to do assessment that aligns with these tenets, but we need to also look at what we're assessing. And Suzanne's going to do an excellent job in a little bit of walking through that part. So we have to take both of these in tandem when we're looking at our assessments to really start implementing these things that we're talking about, or you guys have been talking about through the program. It's not just about the content. We have to look at our assessment. Assessment needs to be thought of as an inquiry, because once we think about our assessment as an inquiry, then that should naturally lead to a reflective state, that we're inquiring and that we're reflecting on, is what I'm doing right and appropriate and really serving all the students that I have in enabling them to be their authentic self. We need to make sure that we're taking an active social change approach to assessment. And this is where I strongly advocate and will support a project-based learning approach. I know it can't always work in classrooms, but really if we want to get to this place where students can be and support their authentic selves in an academic environment, a project-based approach is really going to help them do that. And I'm going to look more closely at what that means in just a second. So I'll revisit it, don't worry. We want to have an increased emphasis on qualitative assessment methods. I know with our growing class size, it's really difficult to think through a qualitative versus a quantitative, where I can run that through a Scantron or have a student aid grade or something, but we really want to think about how a qualitative versus a quantitative assessment type is going to help us down this path. I know it's not always possible, but keep these tenets in mind. Student involvement in the assessment process. Here we go, that open pedagogy piece. If we're going to deconstruct our assessment and really use it as a vehicle to dismantle systems of power, student involvement in that process is imperative. Just like Suzanne talked about in the quote she read in her slide, we come from this majoritarian viewpoint. We've gone through the academic system, whether we think it or not. We've either done 16, 18, 20, however many years within the confines of that system. So it is a part of how we arrange our assessments unless we actively work against that. And one way to actively working against that is to invite students into that assessment process. That's how we deconstruct those assessment. And again, and then lastly, the concept of cultural responsiveness, where instructors use an asset-based approach in teaching that includes student cultures. And how do we do that? If we do it from the outside looking in, if it's not part of us, we have to include students in that process, because we can't say, hey, I know how to do this, when it's not something that is our lived experiences. So that's what we need to start doing, is looking at deconstructing our assessments and how we can use that to dismantle those systems of power and oppression. Suzanne and I didn't say it clearly enough, but please interject. We do have time at the end, but we really did want to make this a back and forth. And since it is a slightly smaller group in here, if you have a question that you want to ask, or a statement, please feel free to unmute or put it in the chat. Suzanne is my brilliant co-presenter at facilitating the chat while I talk, so she will happily interrupt me if needed or answer the question. All right, and this is another coffee cup. I'm not even gonna look at it, Suzanne, because I'm not supposed to read it. So backward design, and just to remind you, that's why we put the presentations in. If you're going, but I wanted to read that, download the presentation, and that's why we gave it to you, because we wanted it rich in research, so you could see. If you have any trouble locating the sources of any of that research, please hit us up and we can provide you with the long source link. All right, so what's the concept of backward design? Again, Suzanne and I battle is are we just putting this in here because we think it's just this beautiful way to design courses, and that the outcomes coordinator part of us is coming out? Does it really apply? As we talked through this, we realized that it has to be a part of this system, because otherwise it's not going to allow students to get to those outcomes in ways that are appropriate and that aren't perpetuating those systems that we were just talking about working against. So what is the basics than a backward design? I promise I won't go into a long narrative of it. It's just what the name implies. You're starting with the end. You're starting with the outcome. You're starting with, this is what my course, whatever it might be, it is all about. And so by starting there, it really helps us to pull out those means from the ends. We don't start with, I really think they need to do a writing project. What is the outcome actually? Do they actually have to write it? And again, Suzanne's going to dive more deeply into this in just a second. But we want to start with, what is my outcome? By starting there, then that can help us realize that the means we think we have to do, we don't actually have to do. There's multiple ways to get to that outcome. And by allowing that student choice, by engaging in open pedagogy and how they get there, that's going to be a way we allow them to be their authentic self, and we help to dismantle those powers. Another one we promised we won't read. So here is just one of the examples of the tools that you can use. I actually stumbled across this as I was doing the research for this and figuring out, okay, what are some real ways that we can, real tools that we can give to help participants to walk this walk, to go down this road. And so the theoretical matrix of culturally relevant assessment was one of those tools that I thought this would be a great just framework to start thinking about our assessments on. And so what this framework does is it asks us to look at our assignments and think about what the utility value is and the inclusive content. And I'm just going to define these two terms really quick for you. Suzanne, I'm relying on you to slow me down if I need to. So or if I need to shout louder, because I know it's getting a little loud out there, so I apologize. So utility value, most of us can probably guess what this means, but let's look at the actual description. It includes assignments that helps individual better understand themselves. And as I'm reading this description, I hope that all of the things you know about open pedagogy and implementing anti-racist principles in your pedagogy will start to say, oh, I see the connection. So utility value, it makes assignments that help individuals better understand themselves, have personal value to students, to improve student understanding of a subject, and provide students with an experience that will be useful in their future career. Now, those of you that know project-based learning as well, go, hey, I see where you're going to go with this connection. And so that's don't forget that connection. So what is inclusive content? We throw around the word inclusivity, so let's define it really quick as it means for this framework. Equally accessible and familiar to all students. So if we take one of these examples that's low in inclusive content, such as multiple choice tests, we know that those are very much stuck in academic language. They are very much biased based on the test writer's personal viewpoint. And those specific words, those specific language that we use can make it so that not only are they low in inclusivity to that student, meaning it doesn't have familiar content to me, but it's also of low utility to me, that it's not useful. I can't use this in the future. And so that is where it becomes not culturally relevant. It becomes an assessment that is not useful. And also it is pushing back against those anti-racist principles that we're trying to apply to our assessments. Any questions? And the slides also that we put in the chat have all the links to get to these tenets or for this framework as well. And here are just different quotes to support it. Again, I promised Suzanne I wouldn't read it, so you can download it as you need. All right.
And I wasn't seeing any questions in the chat, Amanda, but if folks have questions, please do feel free to type them in the chat or raise your hand. So we've talked about what is open pedagogy, and we've talked about how do you think about assessments in general. What we're going to move on to next is looking specifically at how do you design assessments, and then what sort of content can you put in the assessment. But we did want to talk about how do you design assessments in particular, because I think a lot of times faculty are comfortable changing what they teach, but then when we start talking about changing the assignments, that feels different and bigger and challenging, right? So like Amanda was talking about, we're used to assessing in a certain way. And James, your comment in the chat is spot on, right? Of course they have to do a writing project. I did a writing project. Isn't that the way you do these things? And so designing assessments that are anti-racist really requires you to step back and think about, what is the point of my assessments? What am I actually trying to assess? And really doing some deep reflection on, is my assessment actually assessing what I think it is? Or am I just doing it because that's how it was done to me, and so that's what I'm going to do to others? And that, yeah, this is exactly right. This is one of the structures that we inherit, right? Those of us in community college and higher ed, we weren't really necessarily taught how to be teachers. We are taught our discipline. And so we tend to approach teaching in the same way that we were taught. And that can be particularly difficult for assessments because we aren't really generally asked to question our assessments in the way that we're asked to question our teaching. So what we're going to do for the next 3 slides, is look at a traditional assessment and what are some of the challenges that it brings up. And then we'll shift over and Amanda will talk about some ways that we can design assessments that are less problematic. So the first assessment I want to introduce is one that I used in and I teach biology, so this was a biology specific example, where we're teaching students chemical macromolecules, so basically all the chemistry that makes up life. And the main outcome, so backwards design, right? A reminder, backwards design is you start with your outcome. And the outcome is what do these things mean and how are they grouped, right? And so this example is biology, but I think it applies across the board because all of our disciplines have vocabulary that students need to learn. And so the question becomes, how do we assess that knowledge? And like a good STEM instructor, of course, I assess it with multiple choice. So here's my multiple choice question, right? Which relationship is different? And students are asked to identify the one that's different. So I'm going to pause for a little interactivity. What are some issues you see with this assessment? You can unmute or type in the chat. It tests memorization. That's some pretty low level blooms, right? What are some other examples? What am I actually measuring when I give students this question on a test? Yeah, it doesn't give them a way to visualize the difference between the two. It doesn't give them a lot of framework to build on. It's testing pretty solid vocabulary rather than the actual chemical, right? It's testing recognition. Let's move it a bit more globally. So I'm in class. This is a multiple choice test. Here you go. Y'all having flashbacks? All right, 50 questions, 50 minutes. What else am I assessing? Processing speed, right? All of our in-class assignments test recall speed. And in some cases, that may be what I want to assess. If I'm teaching an EMT, I want them fast on their feet. But maybe that isn't as important, right? This is a general education class. And so really what I want students to understand is how biology works, how their body works. And so speed of recall is not that important. And so, yeah, it tests language familiarity. I'm testing English skills, which is important, but it's just not what I wanted to assess with this question, right? Yeah, and how does this relate to activities in the lab, right? In the lab, we're asking students to do things. And that's really, I think, the important piece is, can they do the thing? This is not necessarily helping with that. I'm going to give you one other example, and then I'm going to move on of when I realized this was a problem. After I gave the test, every semester, I would have a couple of students come up to me and ask, why are you dividing these words? And at first I was like, what? Like, really? This was early on in my career. I'm just going to own it, right? Because I was coming from a place of privilege where I knew what this was asking. I knew that this isn't a division symbol. It's a way to look at comparisons. I went to a high school where SAT prep was a thing. We were trained on how to answer these questions. But for students that didn't have that SAT prep, this question is literal nonsense to them. They couldn't even answer it because it didn't make any sense. And so in effect, what I was really measuring is their parents' socioeconomic status. And that's where I realized this is not a good question. This is not getting at what I want to get at. And it's further disenfranchising students that for much of their life have probably been told, you don't belong in college. And here I am validating that because I'm including what's called a hidden curriculum. And if you haven't looked into hidden curriculum, I think it's well worth researching. It's all about those assumptions we make about what students should know. And those assumptions are generally based on our background and our understanding of what it means to be a college professor, right? Like, what if you're going to be in college, there's certain things, and that comes with a lot of bias. And so I'm just going to share really quickly what I shifted to is just telling students, here's what I want you to show me. Tell me that you know what these words are and how they're grouped. And students come up with all sorts of wonderful ways to show this. And I'm not going to go through these because there's other components that we want to get to, but it's amazing how many different ways students come up with to demonstrate the knowledge in a way that is much better at assessing their actual knowledge than was my multiple choice test. So just so I'm not throwing multiple choice under the bus, essays come with their own issues, right? If I'm asking students to demonstrate knowledge using an essay, what else am I assessing? Again, type it in the chat or unmute. What am I assessing here other than their understanding of the nervous system, which is what I had hoped to assess? Being a native speaker of English, right? So students that are not native speakers, they have an added cognitive load of not just having to understand the concept, but then having to explain it to me in my language, because that's what I want, right? And so again, I'm not assessing what I think I'm assessing. Okay, so Amanda, back to you for additional approaches. Carry on.
All right, so let's take a look and dive a little bit deeper into why project-based learning. It doesn't need to be project-based learning, but an open pedagogy and inviting students to collaborate with you in these assessments, either assessment creation or however you want to engage in this open pedagogy process. And here is where my disclaimer comes in, because as we engage in either a project-based learning approach or open pedagogy, or however you want to layer these precepts, you're acknowledging as an educator that you don't know all the answers, that I actually don't know the best way for you as my student to express your knowledge. And for some teachers, that can be a very unnerving and very unpleasant place to be while you're going through this journey. And I always like to use myself as an example. And I know that at the beginning, when I was first started teaching, I had a hard time when a student would ask me, I don't know. My most terrifying moment would be if a student asked me a question I didn't know the answer to. So I always want to acknowledge when I'm asking instructors or teachers to be in a place that's going to make them uncomfortable, that this will, because you are absolutely acknowledging that I don't know the best way for you to express this knowledge to me. I know the outcomes and I know where you want to be, but I don't know what the best way is to get there. And so by engaging in open pedagogy and using a project-based learning, that's what you're doing, is you're allowing students to express their knowledge in a meaningful way that gives value to their lived experience, and allows them to present that lived experience in an academic space that demonstrates their knowledge. And that is really a tough place to be. So that's where project-based learning allows you to do that, where you allow students to look at a problem that they've encountered in their life, they encounter in their community, they encounter in their past. Say, here's the outcome, and you work with them and engage with them to discover how can we get to that outcome in a way that's meaningful for you. And project-based learning has a lot of different avenues to explore, but by working with them to solve that problem and to create ways and context for them to do that, then that's where you're bringing in the open pedagogy as well. So they're helping you to create the assessments to get to that knowledge. And so you're uplifting the cultural values into your course. You're also allowing them to exhibit those skills that in the context of a multiple choice test or the essay that Suzanne was talking about, those skills would not be easily demonstrated and would be missed, and give them value in that academic context. But then has also a lot of those other consequences that come, is building their self-efficacy, knowing that they can work within that by also valuing that authentic selves and their lived experiences. All right, next slide. So then how do we assess these? And I love looking at rubrics when we're talking about open pedagogy, because it's going to bring in all of these other conversations that we've had and really solidify it into that practical, okay, what do we do? So if I'm allowing students to express their knowledge in ways that are meaningful to them and they're helping me to write those assessments, how in the world do I grade those? And I'm going to resist the urge to go down the ungrading path path or the standards-based grading path. I didn't resist the urge to put a little call out there, but I won't read it, I promise. But what you can do is you can easily engage with students in the process of writing that rubric and to create that feedback. So if you use something like a single point rubric, then you can say, here's the criteria that I'm looking for. And it doesn't pigeonhole them into any one specific way to demonstrate that that criteria or get to that outcome, but allows you place for you or the students that you're working with to create this assessment to give feedback on the next step. We want our assessments to clearly represent where students are instead of saying this is how it has to be. So next slide, please. Go ahead and click it one more time. All right. And in that process of students learning to express who they are, their authentic lived experiences, we want to give them the opportunity to practice those skills. And so here's just an example of what that might look like in your class, is you don't have any percentages associated with that ability to practice. And if we're going to give them options to demonstrate that knowledge, then we need to have an accurate assessment of what those skills are. So we just wanted to throw this in here so that you can see that these are things that you can work on in your class to be able to integrate that open pedagogy in a way that's not going to hinder students from expressing their authentic selves and to create opportunity that are going to not allow them opportunities to that's going to put them in a hole that they won't be able to dig out of. Because if a student's saying, hey, I'm going to give this new type of assessment a try, I'm going to work with you on it, and yet because of a misunderstanding or because you were not on the same page, their practice makes them get an F and then they can't pass the class, that's not going to allow them those opportunities to be valued in what their authentic selves are. Any questions? I know that was a lot of words really quickly stated.
There's actually a great comment in the chat about offering flexible assignments for students is great for many of them, but some students want a very kind of step-by-step process. And they're maybe not comfortable being asked to be creative, right? And so, yes, thank you for sharing that. It's important to also give students structure and a framework that they don't have the added load of trying to figure out, okay, what exactly, how am I going to be creative and also do this thing? And I will say the approach I've taken to that is my assignments essentially have two options and only two options. You can show it this way, or you can do anything else, right? So the students that want that linear approach, you give that to them. But then you also allow flexibility. So yeah, thank you for that. We don't want to be forgetting about the students that like the traditional way of learning, traditional in this country anyways. So yeah, thank you.
And that's also going to hold true when you're asking students to engage with you in open pedagogy. I know the first time that I had done engaged in, and I use it a lot in having students to write quiz questions for the next class. And when I asked them to do that, it was very unnerving for them, and it put them in a space that was highly uncomfortable. For many of them, their academic experience had yielded that teachers were the authorities. And so it put them in a very uncomfortable position to be asked to contribute to the academic knowledge that other students would. And so when I did it the second time, I realized that I needed to change things. So the first thing that I did is gave them the option to be anonymous, that they could either be cited, because I really wanted them to know that I value them enough to cite it, but also that they could do this in a way that was anonymous as well. I also gave them another option as well, that they didn't have to, if they felt like this is very much too unfamiliar to me, here is another way that they could show me they knew that standard. So I 100% agree that you do have to provide some of those structures to help students. And a lot of it comes from the narrative of what you're saying as an educator and why you're doing this and what you value. And that's why you're engaging in these more open processes. But absolutely, I agree with those kind of structures and support. All right. So how would this look like when you have a much more formalized rubric? And so I borrowed this from one of my wonderful math colleagues. And when you go through and you look at something that has a very clearly defined criteria, one of the things as educators that we can forget about is that we've, again, gone through that educational structure and come out winners. We've come out at the ends, we've got this faculty position. And so we forget that the language that we use might not be familiar for students, and it might not be appropriate, and it might have different aspects of it that are hindering students' demonstration of their knowledge. And so to make this an open pedagogy experience, invite students to help write the rubric with you. So there's a draft of the rubric that I have. Here are the standards, so they can also clearly see these are the standards of the outcomes that I'm working towards. What is the language in here that can be changed to make it more student friendly, make it more so it demonstrates students' authentic selves and that they can correctly represent the knowledge they have instead of getting caught up on the words. I love to use the example when I was first teaching. I asked students to tell me what a developmentally appropriate curriculum would look like. Now, from my academic experience, I thought that was very clear. You write out what it would be, what are the different developmental domains that you would support. But so many of my students focused on the term look. And so what they chose to write about was the environment, because that was a term, look was associated with the aesthetics. And if I had engaged with them prior in an open pedagogy format and said, hey, let's take a look at this assessment. What are ways that it can be improved so that the vocabulary would be more representative or allow me to get to a more representative knowledge understanding, then that would have really helped. So even when you have rubrics that you love, and I love rubrics, this is a great way to engage in open pedagogy with your students.
And just this is making me realize that when we talk about collaborating with students, we often talk about the benefit to them, but this is a great example of the collaborations are true collaborations, right? We both benefit. They do as well as we do in our course design. Sorry, Amanda, didn't mean to.
No, that was beautiful.
And another food for thought. And then we're going to transition to anti-racist content. So this next section stemmed from our discussions, and it's been really fun prepping for this because we've had some really fun discussions about what makes these assessments truly anti-racist, right? Because what we've been talking about up to this point is assessment design, and a lot of that has to do with being culturally responsive. There are aspects of it, such as dismantling the traditional assessments that can be so rigid that are anti-racist. But I think and we have decided the way to take this to the next step is to also change the content of the assessment. Right. And this is another one of those areas where faculty often get stuck in, but I can't because, right? Which is so easy to do. And generally it comes down to, I can't because I have so much content that I also have to cover. So one of the approaches that is really helpful is to think about the content that we have to cover. Because yes, we do need to cover our content, no question about that. But we also need to understand that the way we got to our current state of affairs in our field is because of what came before. And so all of the understanding we have now has a history, and all of that history has context. And actually our current state of affairs also has context, right? And both of those things can be problematic, but they're also really important to address. So let me give you a few examples in a couple of fields that Amanda and I could think of. And so this is clearly limited down to 2 brains worth of slides. And so there's a lot of folks here, and I think you can come up with a much more robust list, and we'll do that in a little bit. That's going to be part of our discussion at the end, is examples in your discipline. But these are a couple of examples. The first one is, again, out of biology. That's my discipline, speak of biases and limited worldview. We all come from that, and I'm just going to acknowledge it. But in biology, the history of our discipline, many problems, right? Especially when you talk about medicine. But one of the examples here is a Tuskegee study, which if you haven't looked up, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but essentially they brought in participants of a study for syphilis, right? And so these men had syphilis. They happened to be Black men, and the study was essentially, we're not going to treat you, even though at that point they had the treatments, because we're curious to see what happens. And thank you, James, for putting the link in the chat. It's pretty shocking that we would just be like, okay, we're going to let you get sicker and sicker because we're kind of curious. But that's the truth of it, right? And so when we think about people that are not comfortable going to our medical institutions, by the way, this wasn't that long ago. I'm not talking like 1800s. This was fairly recent. This may be why they're not comfortable, but that's something that I can bring in my class, right? This is not me not talking about biology content. This is explaining to students how we got to our understanding. Other disciplines also have this, right? Psychology, similar. Anytime you're studying people, we tend to do that poorly in many ways. In education, the American Indian boarding schools, which I'm using that terminology because that is what they were called. Another example of a just atrocious way that we have treated our fellow human beings in this country and elsewhere as well. But in this country in particular, we essentially, and I'm going to grossly overgloss this, but we rounded up Native American children, took them away from their families, put them in boarding schools where they couldn't use their language, and really treated them atrociously. And again, this was not all that long ago. But in art also, right, ideals of beauty have changed over time, and we can talk about that. So the idea here is bringing these things in isn't instead of your discipline, it is your discipline. These are our disciplines and how we got here, right? And absolutely issues of connections. And this is not just history, right? It's easy to pretend like, oh, wait, that was the bad old days. We're super cool now. We got it. And really, we're not. Again, starting with biology, there's still issues with race in medicine, big issues. In fact, who was it the other day was saying, in medicine, we need to realize that our biases are killing people. Like we are just straight up killing people because of our biases. This is a link to a really nice TED Talk on race-based medicine. So fascinating. But other disciplines as well, right? So in business, the way we market things, lots of bias, lots of problems, lots of harm done, right? In computer science and math, you could talk about algorithms, right? And just how biased the algorithms are. And again, this is not instead of the content, this is the content, right? If you talk about what is computer science, algorithms are a part of that. In finance and real estate, you can talk about redlining. And really in any field, you can talk about how does a student's background in education affect their success in our class? Because that is the truth of it, right? They have to deal with our class content coming from their background. And so acknowledging that, yes, you are human, and this is how we're going to learn. And of course, giving them a way out, right? You don't want to try to be so helpful where you're like, tell me about all your problems, because maybe they don't want to, right? And so always important to give them a way out. All right, so Amanda, back to you for some assessment strategies. How do you build assessments around this topic? Go for it.
Yeah, I also wanted to add on, James had a great comment in the chat that this is still happening. We think about it in the past and we look at the AP courses and what's being proposed, but also if we think about how we support second language learning in our schools, and I know this is a trend that is hopefully being corrected, but for a long time it was just complete English language immersion, and so many children would lose that home language. And I know Sarah talked about those connection issues, and so that's where we have children who lose their first language, lose that connection from their home culture, aren't able to speak to grandparents or other family members because the school system has forced them to detach from that home culture. And so these are things that we continue to do today. So when we think about these are past issues, these aren't past issues. So then how do we make correcting what's going on and correcting those past influences part of what we do in our classrooms? And so we can tie that open pedagogy, excuse me, into those assessment strategies by doing renewable assignments, doing things like allowing them to add to Wikipedia. Wikipedia is wrought with old dead white men. And those that have contributed have been those that are in places of power, and usually those are white men. And so by allowing students to put in their voice and creating that opportunity to say, we value you enough to put those thoughts into writing through the wikiedu.org process is an amazing way to allow them to exhibit their authentic selves. You can add case studies or sidebars to the textbooks if you're talking about a concept and a student wants to contribute and say, hey, this is a lived experience. Or if you're engaging and using that OER, you can change some inaccuracies of a student saying, hey, that is not the experiences that I have had. You can change it right there, add those case studies, add those sidebars. And one of the things that Suzanne and I talked about when we were dialoguing about this presentation is when you have the opportunity to do this semester by semester, then you're allowing students to dialogue about something that conflicts with maybe what a previous class had said. So if you have a student that said, hey, that's not my lived experience, I want to fix this, and you have the student in the next class saying, hey, that's opposite from my experience, then it gives you the opportunity to have those conversations because you're bringing them into your classroom. And so that would be one way you're adding those case studies or sidebars to the textbook that you can co-create with your students. Create a class website or repository of the findings that you find. Canvas has different ways to do that. Google Docs, there's lots of different technology enabled ways that you could create those repositories where students are working collaboratively to add that information. I'm sharing links that you find that can help to change the narrative that has been perpetuated either in the book or the content or the assessments that you're using. Bookmarking tools such as Digo or even Pinterest or Raindrop is the one that I use to create and curate those websites that are going areas that are going against that majoritarian view that students want to share, or using community annotation tools such as Hypothesis or Perusal. There's other ones out there to allow them to, first of all, demonstrate their knowledge, because we're talking about using this as an assessment tool, give value to their authentic selves and their lived experiences, and to co-create with you the assessments for next semester, the content for next semester. And again, going back to what we talked about earlier, making this an inclusive and high utility assignments, those have meaning to students. They're contributing back to a problem that they've lived in their own life. And so they're helping to correct that. That is such a high utility. And they're coming from a place that is accessible to them because they're searching for the words and the websites that is something that is accessible to them. So we're engaging in both of those frameworks at the same time. And so assessment strategies, we want to keep these in mind because we really want to, again, honor the experiences that students are come from. You need to allow them the opportunity to work in groups or work individually. And American culture is incredibly individualistic. And so that's why you do typically have this pushback. I'm definitely among them. I just want to work by myself. Group work doesn't work. There's always someone that does one work. We've all had given that explanation, and so have our students. So you want to allow them the opportunity, acknowledging this is their experience, but But you also want to allow them the opportunity to work in groups. Some of our students come from a highly collectivist culture, and so they want to be able to share in that knowledge, and that's a much more comfortable place for them to be, to work on that group knowledge together and collectively. So you want to create that opportunity for them when you're engaging in this open pedagogy for them to do it together. Again, future students can build on the work of the previous classes. They can add to it, give examples, or they might say, this is contrary to my lived experience. And what a great opportunity to have that dialogue between students when you're looking at previous class works. You don't have to be the expert talking about that uncomfortable space that we have to operate in. It gives you the opportunity to say, hey, I don't know, and really value that student's input by bringing yourself off of that platform or that pedestal and saying, I don't know. Let's co-construct this knowledge together. Give students the opportunity if they want to share or not. Just like I talked about in my previous experience of creating those quiz questions with students, you want to allow them the opportunity to opt out. If you really feel it's important for them and engage and they just want to share with you, then make that an option. If they want to publish and make it available to the wider community, make sure that you've clearly discussed what that Creative Commons license is and what it means can be done for their work moving forward, so they can get an informed decision and give them the power to be able to say, you get to choose what is done with your work. That dialogue in itself is so empowering for students who might not have had that been option to do that before, that they have the power to choose, this is what you get to do with the work that you create. So if just saying things like that is so different than many of the experiences our students have had. So this is small, so I'm going to go ahead and read it to you. It's Anti-Racist Pedagogy, as acknowledged by Kishimoto in 2018, focuses on the process of learning, not necessarily making students reach a uniform prescribed outcome. Anti-racist teaching challenges the Eurocentric curriculum and the apolitical and ahistorical approaches to education, discipline, and course materials. By encouraging faculty to co-construct syllabi, assignments, and assessments with students in the hopes of diminishing the historical power differential between the two groups.
Giving folks a few seconds to process that. Okay. All right, so that is all that we had. What we wanted to do is spend some time where you can really think through what this means for you. So I know part of what you're doing in O4 is coming up with a project. And so hopefully this is kind of helping with that. I'm not exactly sure on the timeline of when the projects are due. But if it's assessment related, maybe this will help you design a project for an anti-racist assessment. Sandra.
Yes, thank you so much for all of this information. It's really wonderful. I'm an African-American woman, and I've been teaching over 20 plus years. And, you know, for years, I've been teaching from my own worldview and from my own perspective, obviously. So while a lot of this is kind of organically familiar, the process and strategies are really kind of structured, and I like that. I'm learning so much. But I'm just wondering, you know, why do you think this whole move toward anti-racist pedagogy in higher education has gained the kind of attention now as opposed to 20 years ago, when I know a lot of my colleagues who have been teaching this, trying to teach this way, not in a structured way, or but just kind of teaching from their own perspective. Why now is my question.
And that's a great question. I wish I had a good answer, and maybe if somebody else wants to chime in as well. I think so. I'm hypothesizing, again, based on my very limited worldview. It had to do with all of the cultural shifts that happened more broadly in this country. right? I think that it brought to the forefront something that a lot of folks were already doing, and that other folks just didn't even realize was a problem until, you know, those of us in very I was going to say privileged areas, we could hide from the realities. And so it really required it to be put in front of us, and for us to be like, oh, I see. Yeah, we're doing harm. I gotcha. And I think that might be part of it. I don't know if others have a different or clearer viewpoint on that.
I don't think I have a more clear viewpoint, and I'm just going to speak from my personal experience coming through up until grad school. None of this terminology and experiences of others were familiar to me, but it wasn't until grad school where I had an instructor who forced me to talk about white privilege and talk about redlining. Did it really start my journey? And then it was dormant for a while. But then I had other people in my life that said, let's talk about this, let's challenge this. So I think that collective effort, Sandra, that you're talking about for the past 20 years, as finally, you know, you have enough people that are willing to finally listen, that the noises become much louder. And it does, it breaks my heart that you've been, you know, doing this work for 20 years and it's taken so long. I can only imagine the frustration that it's taken so long. And there's so much work still to do, you know, that's the answer from my personal experience. I know some probably have a much more eloquent. I also think that there's so much more research that is being published and being willing to be published. I know it's always probably been out there. I just finished a fantastic book that a lot of the research we found was from that helped to solidify a lot for others.
And Amanda, may be worth putting the link to that or sending it to them to include, because it looked like a great book. It's on my reading list. And Jamie, I just want to acknowledge you're right that we have, and actually both of your comments are right. We've had this moment after George Floyd in particular, where as a country we started looking at these things in a way that we hadn't been to the extent that we needed to have been. And so even though, and I'm kind of reading what you're saying, so even though there's been more national visibility, there are still local inequities that are expanding. So 100% want to acknowledge that. It's interesting. We tend to focus on one issue that we're solving, and sometimes others get pushed by the wayside, or they even gain in problematicness. But yeah, thank you for sharing that.
And thank you for just trying to engage and have a discussion around that question. Much appreciated.
I had the opportunity to listen to Dr. Chris Emden a couple of weeks ago, and this is fantastic. If you haven't read any of his books or heard him talk, he was one of the best speakers I have ever heard. But one of the things that he had said was we need to start willing to make mistakes. And so for me, it was a big thing because he was talking about using call and response in our teaching and the importance of using call and response. And so, you know, he was very eloquent how he said it, but he said, I know, all of you white people out there are thinking that's cultural appropriation. He says, you need to be willing to try and have a conversation around it. And so that's one of the things, Sandra, that I've been trying to do is have conversations that are hard to have and be willing to be called out and said, okay, I'm going to give this a try. Tell me how it goes. And here's the reason that I'm doing it. So thanks for giving us the opportunity to have that conversation.
Yeah, and I just want to call out one of the things Maria posted in the chat that is just brilliant is a lot of times we get pushback on this sort of work about creating more adaptable assessments and doing other than the norm of what people expect. We get pushback to the point of our courses may not be articulated. And yeah, and that's hard. But then when they actually see what our students are learning, it's like we have to demonstrate that our students are learning more than they would have if we had been doing it the old way. So I'm glad, and UCLA is a big one to actually get approval from. That's awesome. I'm going to stop sharing so that we're not just looking at a blank slide. And if you want to unmute your videos, we can have a discussion. We have, I think, about 10 more minutes or so about how might you apply this to your discipline, or questions you have, thoughts. It's your time, essentially.
I'll chime in if I can, Suzanne. Going back to your question of examples from our disciplines. I used to teach history, so I'm an historian. I still read history and think as an historian. And goodness gracious, I think back to the syllabus and the course outline that I inherited when I first started teaching history, and the textbooks that I used, talking about the great Western expansion, discovering America. And all the heroes were the Europeans, and all the heroes were cowboys, and all the heroes were American soldiers. It's just incredible. It's I just hang my head in shame today that I didn't know better at the time, and I just can't imagine how upside down I would turn the course if I were going to teach it today. And strangely, I can't speak to what's actually taught in a community college history class today. I don't follow that, but I do follow historiography, and I know that there's tremendous, brilliant, path-breaking research going on amongst professional historians to change the narrative and to fill in the gaps and to completely reframe the way in which we view, or in which we can choose to view in a historically evidence-grounded way, the story of America. And this reminds me of Jamie's webinar, Jamie Thomas's webinar with us in December, talking about how important it is to ground our anti-racist teaching in the evidence and in our disciplines, so that we're not teaching anti-racism necessarily, but we're teaching in an anti-racist way that is, again, grounded in our particular disciplines. So going back to your point, Suzanne, about the Tuskegee experiment, well, that's a chapter in the history of biology and medicine. It's not anti this or pro this, it's a fact. So thank you. I just, can't shut up about the way history is changing.
I can jump in as a historian on this, not so much to talk about my own work, but one thing I want to mention about this open idea and how, student research can have a public impact. I'm thinking of a story that came up in Bakersfield recently, where there was a monument that was built to a kind of early 19th century American traveler, who hunted beaver and whatnot. And and on the one hand, I understand the importance of celebrating and building monuments, and what James is talking about, Western expansion, but the kind of pushback that it's getting among some folks who know what James is talking about, the story of settler colonialism. I mean, I'm being contacted to sort of comment on these issues, but I'm thinking about it from the perspective of what my students might encounter, like when they're walking into a public space, right? I mean, so history, not just in the classroom, but what they would experience outside. And, I'll mention briefly the project that I did with OFAR that related to open was using ArcGIS, story mapping, and, student community archive generation. But I'm thinking about, the idea of mapping. I mean, and so, I just wanted to just bring up this issue of relevancy, like with public memorials and what students see when they leave the classroom, at least as it relates to my field. Again, that might have relevance in something like biology or math, and how you see these things outside the classroom, and designing assessments, right, to kind of funnel into the student lived experience outside of the classroom.
Well, and some of you might have caught the news. Cabrillo College changed its name, or has voted to change its name, because the college was named after Juan Cabrillo, an early Spanish colonist, or quote unquote explorer. So they've voted to change their name. They haven't adopted a new name yet, but can you imagine teaching history at Cabrillo College these days? What a really fun challenge that would be to have a really concrete basis with which to engage students on this kind of conversation.
Anyone out there from the STEM field who want to share? That's my original discipline, if I have any discipline at all.
Yay for STEM. Yeah, if anyone has thoughts on what they might want to do and to get some feedback, we're happy to do that as well. This is a good chance to, you've got people in the room to brainstorm ideas with. Yeah.
I'll just jump in really quick. I'm Jamie, and I'm just so fascinated by this idea of co-creating the rubric with students. And so I just want to ask about the timing of this. Are you doing this kind of like in the first weeks of class, or are you doing this maybe as you approach a new assignment and you want to inform students about the assignment, but then also inform them or have them kind of work with you during class time, maybe to kind of see what would those kind of assessment points be for that new assignment or something? Okay, Amanda's saying she co-creates after discussing the assignment. Okay.
Yeah, well, yes to all of those.
Okay.
I'm a messy process kind of person, so I'm just going to speak to how I operate. And I'm always so transparent with my students to, hey, we're going to give this a try. And it's one of those iterative processes where you get to do it every semester. Just because one class last year created the rubric, it might not be appropriate for this one, or because of timing or whatever might have happened in the course, you don't have time to engage in that dialogue, and it would be a disservice to them to engage in that. So for me, it's one of those things where I feel it out to what's going to be most appropriate and when to engage. If it's going to cause more stress, like we were talking about before, for the students, depending on what the course is. When I've done it in class, it's been super fun because, we've had it up on the board and they've, put their comments over there and made it such a kinesthetic type of experience. And messy is just the best word to do it. And, we didn't end up with a final product at the end, but in the process of engaging in that process, they understood the assignment so much better. I was able to revise and revisit because what they were reflecting on how to assess it, realized that how I had explained what I wanted to do was totally off base, because they were going to assess it in something that, no, that's not where I wanted to go with this. And so just that whole process allowed us to engage in the content at a level that would never have been there. So although we didn't walk away with a rubric, they walked away with a greater understanding of the content, which ultimately, is the process that we wanted to get to. So yes to all of them. Whatever works good for you and is the best place for you to be with your students. I'll just share one of our STEM faculty in biology had their students go out into, I'm in the Central Valley, and so go out and look at valley fever and how it began in our area and research that. And I can't remember all of the sciencey pieces of it, but it was very much a part of what their experiences were living in the Central Valley, and family members that have been affected it and how it grew, and those types of things. I'm sure, Suzanne, you can fill in the sciencey terms, but it was something that was very personal to them, but it also helped them reach the outcomes of the course, which was learning about diseases or how it grew, or that kind of thing. It's kind of like when we were in elementary and you swabbed the toilet seat and you looked at it and it was in the bathroom and it was so disgusting, those types of things.
Although, to be fair, that always came back as cleaner than the public computers, just saying. Okay, so I think we wanted to leave a few minutes for the survey and such. Yeah.
Yeah. Liz, would you mind? Oh, thank you. Liz did post it in there, even though it looks like I did it. Thank you so much, Liz. I also wanted to mention to those of you who are left and those of you who will listen to the recording, we have Dr. Edward Bush from Los Consumes at Rivers College coming next month. And yes, Suzanne and Amanda, you can join us if you want. He's a wonderful speaker and is going to be talking about anti-racism in the California community colleges. And the following month in March, we're asking for volunteers from you all to share some of the open pedagogy work you've done. Sorry, that's not, I just completely misspoke. What we're asking you to share is some of your expertise in areas aligned with the OFAR goals. This could be equitable grading. Help me out, James. Could be, I've forgotten now. It's all, the
Well,
brain is dead.
well, we looked closely at your original applications and your introductions in the OFAR course in the fall, and many of you revealed many interesting research projects, volunteering in your communities, doctoral dissertations, community projects, etc., that we think would benefit and enlighten all of us in OFAR. So we know who you are. Please volunteer, or we'll reach out and gently volunteer you.
It will be a volunteer thing, but we will be calling on a few of you, and those of you who are here today, likely candidates, along with what James had to say. And because it's a demonstration of open pedagogy, you are the students in OFAR, in a manner of speaking. And so you are going to be teaching the rest of the cohort about some area of expertise that you have. So it's a demonstration of open pedagogy, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So thank you in advance for thinking about doing some of this. And we'll only be able to select a few, but I think it's going to be a lot of fun, and it might be something we repeat later if there's enough interest. And thank you for filling out our survey. And thank you so much to Suzanne and Amanda. Amazing presentation. I always learn more every time I come to one of your presentations.
I'll give them a plug again. We've benefited at College of the Canyons from them on multiple occasions, keynoting our retreats or our faculty retreats or our convocation, et cetera, et cetera. So they are a dynamic duo. Hit them up. I don't know if they have any space on their calendars, but if you're looking for really looking for what you just experienced, but with homegrown California community college faculty, please think about them. It's always good to have our own, learn from our own.
Well, have a wonderful weekend, everybody. And thank you again. It was wonderful to spend time with all of you.